think we're on. Yes, we're on live. Hello, everybody. My name is Josh Brister. This is the Christian Resistance. I'm here with Paul Vander Klay and Robert White. We're going to be discussing atheism, the problems with atheism. I think the talk today is titled "Answering Atheists." We're going to try to present philosophical arguments, just different kind of arguments from history maybe. I think the best argument that really shuts atheism down is common sense. When you look at the world around you, it just seems there's too many signposts that point to God. There's too many reasons. I've lived for too long and seen too many things that point to God and away from a shallow atheism. So that's what we're going to be discussing. But I want to say right off the bat, whenever I do a podcast, and for all my podcasts, the main reason is to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think all of us are in agreement here with that. So I want to start with you, Paul. I want you to introduce yourself and tell viewers just briefly about yourself. I understand you're a pastor. I want to hear about that, but feel free to introduce yourself.
Okay. My name is Paul Vander Klay. I'm a pastor at Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento, California. I'm probably only on here because about 3 years, almost 4 years ago now, I bumped into the work of Jordan Peterson, and in watching not just Peterson, but especially his audience, I began to notice that people who had been deconstructing, which is the word that's often used, people who had been deconstructing, had sort of been dismissing Christianity, had been identifying as atheists in significant numbers, began to become Bible curious. And I hadn't seen anyone quite so successful at that as Peterson. And that was particularly peculiar because Peterson himself doesn't go to church, isn't a member of any particular denomination or any church at all. And then when he started his biblical series, it was something unlike anything I'd ever heard. And so I began making commentaries on his biblical series and offering some critique of his work. And that sort of got me into this strange world of YouTube. I don't usually do debates. The one that I really enjoyed was my conversation with Vaush. And you can find, if you just Google or YouTube Paul Vander Klay Vaush, you can find that conversation. It went quite well. I don't worry about atheists and atheism too much because I don't really think it's going to last another 100 years in the form it is now. We're already seeing it breaking down. I think that the bigger questions are what's coming down the road behind it, because while I don't think atheism has much of a life left in it, atheists are now pretty viciously fighting with each other over a lot of culture war issues. Yeah. That doesn't mean that a lot of young people aren't leaving the church because they're also finding particular contemporary formulations uncompelling, making the job of the church challenging in trying to figure out, okay, how the culture is changing so rapidly. How can we talk about who Jesus Christ is and what do we mean by this word God in a way that connects with people and helps them make better sense of their lives? So I would say over the last 3 years, what I've been doing on YouTube has been exactly that.
Yeah. Great. You mentioned Jordan Peterson. I think that's a name. That's the kryptonite to the atheist subculture, that they hate Jordan Peterson. I've been looking at some of your videos, and I knew of them beforehand, and you make great videos, great commentary on Jordan Peterson and on the hierarchy of values that we all live by. we all live by a hierarchy. And even if we say that something is better than or worse than something, well, we're using a hierarchy of values, and we have to ground that hierarchy. So it's very easy. I often like to say that atheists live as though God does exist, or the logos is a living embodiment in their lives. And I think a lot of philosophers have picked that up too. But you're doing a great job, Paul, on that.
Well, thank you,
Robert. I'm not as familiar with you, but I think you're an intellectual, young, and just showing your intellectual strengths. Tell me about yourself and why you think it's important to try to give arguments against atheism.
Yeah, I like this because Paul comes from such an interesting angle of starting from the sort of Jordan Peterson subculture, which that's its own almost unusual angle. I feel like a lot of apologetics and a lot of pastors are just coming head on, just where are those atheists and let me tell them what's right or whatever. And so I find that angle interesting. My own angle is also a little bit of a backdoor in the sense that I grew up a Christian, pretty conservative, very genuine Christian family and church, but pretty conservative. I would say a fundamentalist in some of their views. I've always had an engineering philosophical mindset. And so a lot of those views started to crumble, or at least be very questioned by myself as I got older. Ultimately into college, it started to feel like it was falling apart. And I finally just realized I needed to completely dig in and figure this out. So I really feel like I did the dreaded deconstruction that everyone is talking about, except that I pulled it all the way apart and then slowly put it back together. But it was different when I put it back together. I jettisoned some beliefs. Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Well, I was just going to say, I come from a similar background. I did have doubts. I've been studying for a while, Christian philosophy for over 20 years now. I had some doubts, but the important thing, I think, and I think this goes to a lot of Christians out there that sometimes have doubts. Doubts are okay, and it's okay to have doubts from time to time, but it's not okay to fall into the trap that we should live by skepticism. Skepticism can't account for its own skeptical outlook. We all start with starting points or things we bring and take to the table. That's what Immanuel Kant said. Nobody lives by pure reason, in quotes. The atheist, right, I think, often likes to pretend that pure reason, well, you can't demonstrate the existence of God. Perhaps not. That's an open question, but we can give a probabilistic case for why God does exist, why Christianity is true.
And one thing I'd like to add to that is a lot of times it's pitted almost exclusively or almost always by atheists. It's stated as if we all believe that, the universe is here. Now you're trying to add on this thing called God. And do you have reasons to believe that? And so then you get into this infinite discussion about burden of proof. And, then you let the skeptic feel safe that it's like, well, I can stay here as an atheist until you have reached the goalpost, I've decided on to believe. And I'm sympathetic. I see how they get to that, because they're starting from sort of an assumed naturalism. But ultimately, and this is why I love epistemology, I wanted to get past it. Once you watch a billion of these debates, which probably all three of us have, there's a lot of ships passing in the night. There's a lot of people using one type of argument for their side and then criticizing a similar structured argument on the other side that feels arbitrary. And so I got really into I've almost become a little meta in trying to figure out when to play the mystery card. When is it okay to play the mystery card in a legitimate way? When is it okay to appeal to authority and a scholarly consensus? Because I think we all intuitively know that it makes sense to appeal to scholarly consensus, at least to a degree, but we also intuitively know that consensus can be wrong sometimes. So I really focus on that stuff to try. And the other thing is that sort of stuff helps you with all areas of life, politics, living your life, even relationships, how you understand yourself and people you're in a relationship with. But to bring it full circle, I think the more helpful way to state the what we're dealing with here, the debate, if you will, is there is data out there. What is the best explanation of the data? Because that puts atheism, Christianity, anything else on a level playing field. It's not that one has the burden of proof and the other doesn't. It's that we're all trying to explain the same data set, which gives the best explanation. So that's how I would frame it.
And you shouldn't limit explanations to physical explanations. That's something called scientism. I think by looking at the evidence, we should present a cumulative case, and not think or look at the world, the phenomenological world, with humility. Come at it with humility, not the dogmatism of Richard Dawkins or someone like that. This was from my debate with Graham Oppie. We hear things in the range of frequencies extending from about 20 to about 20,000 hertz. We hear sounds. We see light whose wavelengths are longer than about 380 millimicrons and shorter than 760 microns. And even as passive observers, we have access to only a portion of physical reality. And for an object or an event to have meaning, or for it to have any saliency whatsoever, we must already be tuned to perceive it. We must have a framework or working set of assumptions in which to categorize it and to interpret and classify it. It seems that atheism, even at the level of physics, is presumptuous. We can't even explain all of physical reality. So it seems to me that we need to have humility and step back. Paul, do you think atheists, or let me explain to me how you think atheists and skeptics live as though God does exist? Is it according to that hierarchy of values, that natural law that's within inside them, that they presuppose whenever they're living their life? How would you answer that question?
I think most of us, when we're very young, create within ourselves a first draft of the world. It's a very sophisticated first draft that we made without even knowing we were making it. You find this, well, if you get married, because you wake up one morning and now suddenly, instead of being a single person, now you're a husband. And you find that you have roles and expectation that you expect your wife to fulfill, and roles that you have. And then suddenly your wife, who did not have the same first draft written into her, looks at you like, what are you talking about? And so right there, you begin to recognize, okay, we are all in many ways programmed from actually before we're even born.
Yeah.
We already imprint our parents' voices are already imprinted upon us. And so we begin this world not from see, this is part of my objection to modernity, not from some observer point of view where the observer is excluded, but we begin this world with a whole set of assumptions. Now, another one of my favorite authors is Tom Holland, who recently wrote a book entitled Dominion. And I think that book, probably even better than Jordan Peterson, demonstrates that this line between Christian and non-Christian in terms of identity is far thinner than most people would imagine. Because what I think he demonstrates fairly convincingly is that whether people know it or not, they have absorbed from their parents, from their friends, from the culture, a moral package that has been significantly, that can be significantly attributed to Jesus Christ. And for part of me, when I watch some celebrity atheists try to do combat on the internet and debunk Christianity, they almost always use Christian moral terms to complain about Christians, the Bible, and Christianity. In other words, the yardstick that they use presupposes the system that they are trying to debunk. And they, for the most part, they're completely unaware of this. And then if you actually challenge them on it, they'll take a step back and say, no, this is from the Enlightenment. Well, the Enlightenment was by no means a Christian-free clean room, because the Enlightenment is a product in many ways of the conflict between Roman Catholicism and the Protestant Reformation. And so you keep stepping that back, which is basically what happened with Tom Holland, which was he had written a book about the origins of Islam.
Yeah.
And someone didn't like that. And they said, well, study your own religion. And he said, well, I don't have one. And then he began to think, well, where do my ideas come from? And so he starts this search, only to realize that he who had been a fan of the pagan classical period, the more he studied that period, recognized that the entire conceptualization, moral conceptualization of that world was completely alien to him, and that whether he knew it or not, his values had been deeply shaped by Christianity, and he was demanding that atheists live according to that code. And then suddenly he had a personal realization: how Christian am I? And if in fact I have these values, can these values outlive the structure beneath them that Christianity has been affording for basically the last 2,000 years, that many atheists are trying to debunk using Christian tools?
Yes.
So that's been my take on it.
Absolutely. And that's a great point. Here's the book that you were mentioning, Dominion, and it's just a great book. It shows, and let me read the subtitle: Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And I just want to read one excerpt on page 17. This is Tom Holland speaking, and quote, "So profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization that it has come to be hidden from us. It is the incomplete revolutions which are remembered. The fate of those which triumph is to be taken for granted." We've all incorporated so many Christian doctrines. Even the atheist has, kind of like, I think, the doctrine of the intrinsic goodness of humanity. And I think a lot of atheists live like that, that they think people, have intrinsic value and importance. They don't think all people sometimes think like that, but they tend to think that people have intrinsic value and goodness. Well, I think that's from the doctrine of creation. But a lot more could be said on that. I'm just so happy you brought up this book. I just finished it, by the way. It's a great book, Dominion by Tom Holland. There are other authors that I could mention that go along with that. Rodney Stark is a great one. Rodney Stark. Here is one book, and I've mentioned to people, One True God by Rodney Stark. You also have The Triumph of the West by Rodney Stark, that makes the case that we just take for granted many of the things, the ideas, the moral, the things we think are important in our lives. Robert, I wanted to ask you or bring you in on the conversation about what Paul said. How do you have anything to add concerning what Paul said, or to piggyback on what Paul said?
Yes. Yeah. I'm afraid I have forgotten what I was about to say about that. But let me see if I can recover it, because I wanted to kind of steelman part of what Paul said. First of all, I really love Tom Holland as well. I haven't read that book yet, but I've watched, I think, all of his interviews on The Unbelievable Show, which you guys are probably familiar with. Yeah, he's great. I love his stuff. But what I wanted to bring up is that a skeptic response to part of that might be that the intrinsic values, intrinsic morality we sense is simply evolution, or even evolution gone wrong, or something like that, a byproduct of evolution. Obviously, that's a very common response. First of all, that doesn't really explain why did Christianity touch such a nerve to where it took over. Maybe it's coincidental. Like, you could just say, roll the dice that, it's all evolutionary, and some religion had to get the one that somehow, in Richard Dawkins' terms, had the most powerful meme that caught on, etc. But all that, what it doesn't fully explain is that ultimately those moral intuitions, when you rewind the clock, you have to ask, how does that compare to even our intuition about the physical world? And before even going to that, just think of other evolutionary traits. It doesn't bother us to think, when you are told that we could have evolved with 6 fingers instead of 5, someone might find that surprising, especially a child who never really thought of it. But then you're like, okay, that's a little weird, but I get that. I can picture a world where humans evolved with 6 fingers instead of 5. But if you ask, what if we evolved to where rape was okay, or where torturing a child was beneficial to society? There's something much deeper within us that rebels against that. And that just shows us that our intuition about morality feels much more cosmic or objective. Now, that could still be wrong. Point to the atheist that maybe that's still wrong. But number one, now you're really going up against a deep intuition, your atheism. You're going back, and then at some point, that intuition becomes so deep, you can start to compare it to our intuition that the physical world exists. Because we can think of scenarios where our intuition about a moral situation might feel more real than our intuition that the physical world exists. And just to give an example of, some awful situation in a past war where a father is watching their child being killed. And if you ask that father, which is more true, that this is evil, what you're seeing, or that you are sitting in your house right now, the father might say that this is evil. That's more true. Like, I could be having a nightmare right now, and this is not real. And my point is that we need to take seriously how deep and secure those intuitions feel, because ultimately, as we know from, epistemology, if you want to go the hyper skeptical route, then we don't even know the physical world is true. But if we're going to accept that, then some of these moral intuitions go nearly as deep. And we need to at least take it seriously. And it's serious weight. It's serious disadvantage to the atheistic side to have to take on the idea that you might have to give that up. That is a serious cost potentially. And you know what? They try hard. Atheists, try to build up these systems to explain it, to still give it the same amount of meaning. I think it's a big uphill battle, and it just fits like a glove if there is a God. That's how.
And it seems to me it's they try to reduce objective morality, which are every intuition says that certain things are really objectively bad, or certain things are objectively good. They try to reduce that to the natural, to a purely natural order. And it seems to me that they confuse epistemology, how we come to know through the evolutionary, era, through the period, with ontology, whether an action is really bad or really good. And it seems to me a common sense perspective, and I want to get you in on this, Paul, a common sense perspective would say, like you said, Robert, we have no better reason to deny objective moral values and duties exist in the world than to deny that the external world itself exists. We both come at that with our intuitions, trusting in our cognitive and sensory perceptions to give us reliable information about the external world. But Paul, here's my question to you. And this was what Robert was talking about. Can pure naturalistic evolution and processes account for morality? Does it account for morality? Or is that kind of an ad hoc, simplistic view based on their, not want to leave open the possibility that God exists?
I think one way to frame that question might be to ask what science is. There's a philosopher, Wilfrid Sellers, who was in Pittsburgh. There's another philosopher, teaches University of Texas at Austin, Daniel Bonavac, who was a student of his, who has some very good lectures on YouTube about this, making the point that, and Jordan Peterson makes almost exactly this point in his 2015 Transliminal interview, where the way science works is we attempt to get a picture of what I call a monarchical vision of the world by taking out all agency, all personal agency. It's sort of like covering one eye and seeing the world through one eye. And this has been the predominant method since we began to discover this amazing tool of science. And that tool works very well when we're dealing with physical objects in the world, fairly discrete patterns of cause and effect that can be scaled up pretty dramatically in things like computers. But the assumption of all of that is you take out a person. The difficulty with that is that you also have to take out ought, because there is no question how fast should this lens cap fall. That doesn't make any sense in that universe with one eye closed. All you ask is, how fast does this lens cap fall? Now, if you had some strange mousetrap experiment by which you needed this lens cap to reach my hand at a certain amount of time, you might then apply a certain degree of force, but there's within that a goal. And a goal also is not part of this scientific universe. Now part of what happened after we discovered, wow, we can learn a lot about the world by covering one eye. And in fact, the people who did this initially were Christians and considered this to be something like natural theology, because they saw God moved the world. And in order to learn about things like Newtonian mechanics, I'm actually learning about God, because as the Apostle Paul quotes a Stoic scholar, in a Stoic poet, in him we live and move and have our being. So these were Christians trying to know God better. So this is what we began to do, and we began to find it taught us a lot about the world. But I call this sort of a naturalist lab leak, because it works really well in the lab, and it can really help us solve a lot of things, but it can't tell us what should happen. It can only tell us what is happening, or perhaps what does happen. But this language of should requires a whole nother universe, which Wilfrid Sellers called a manifest image, which is now the realm of persons and oughts and shoulds and all of these things. And now we naturally see through both eyes. But to apply should and say science is going to tell me what I should do, no, it doesn't tell you what you should do. It maybe gives you some insight in terms of what you can do, but it also doesn't give you any goals. And so what usually happens is sort of a goal sneaks in along the way, and that's how we try to come up with this scientific image of science, but it's really from a different universe.
Yeah, it seems to me that it tries to make us into less than humans, like a bipolar type of human. It seems to me atheism or naturalism tries to take science, the explanatory success of the physical world, and apply it to the world of lived life, to the world of human behavior and interaction. That's what I mean by common sense. Common sense takes the world as it is, takes the world of becoming and being, and doesn't try to legislate or reduce one down to the other. But it does seem that science, or these naturalistic atheists like Richard Dawkins, are trying to legislate what science is onto a completely different reality, on human interaction, on psychology, on human personhood. Robert, do you what do you think? I think what, Paul, you're talking about is that the naturalist, the atheist, is committing the is-ought fallacy. Is do I understand that right, Paul? Are you talking about the is-ought fallacy?
I'm saying that in many ways, all human beings need to live with both eyes, and what we tend to do is smuggle telos, goals, ought into the one eye, and we don't recognize what we're doing. And so we're just sort of eye switching all the time. When you say science doesn't say anything. People use science to say things that people want to say, and all of those other things sort of get smuggled in underneath.
And when a person says science says that, it does seem like they're trying to legislate science. It just seems to me like the atheist, naturalist, and I say this with all due respect, but if it seems to put a schizophrenic type of person, a person that doesn't live as an actual human, if they're going to act like that, have science control their behaviors. No, we have free will. We all intuitively know that we don't have to, do certain things. We have a choice the way we act and the way we behave. Robert, do you have anything to add on this?
No, I think it relates back to the original question, of how do atheists live as if there's a God. And you could kind of just put it under the umbrella terms of like morality and meaning, that we all kind of have to live with those two things. It takes an immense will to do away with either of those things. And you could even question if you could even permanently, psychologically do away with those things. And once again, it's an uphill battle to philosophically build those from atheism. Maybe it's possible, but it fits way better with theism. And arguably, I think you can argue it's impossible with atheism. And at the very least, it's a very uphill battle for sure.
Yeah, and that's why I always I always try to emphasize how we look at the world and have humility. Before we try to remake the world, claim we speak for science, as Richard Dawkins tries to legislate what science is in a person's life, step back and have humility. What we discover is that there are laws of nature, and that certainly seems to imply there's a lawmaker behind those laws. So it seems to me a common sense explanation will take into account the scientific laws that the physical world is governed by, but also human interaction, that we do have something in us, free will. At least it seems that we do have free will. It seems that free will is a presupposition for ethics, for morality, to be possible, for even our law system to be possible. Paul, what do you think about those atheists, those naturalists that are so adamant about declaring that, of course, we don't have free will? We do not have free will. What do you think about that, and how would you respond to that?
Well, I am a Calvinist, so I think first thing we should say is let's not Jesus' command is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And via the parable of the Good Samaritan, that goes all the way up to and including your enemy and your religious and philosophical rival. So I don't think these kinds of debates generally argue people out of atheism. People, I think, drop out of atheism when they begin to see that it's probably not going to get them what they want. Because what people want is quite predictable. People want to be loved. People want to be respected. And a universe, so if you listen to someone like Tom Holland, who has been reflecting on this transformation that's been happening in his life over the last number of years, he's still not sure about a whole realm of things like the physicality of the resurrection, like the availability of the power of the Holy Spirit in his life. And so on that score, he's still got quite a bit of skepticism. But what he does know is that you're far better off living as if your actions actually have consequence in this world. Now, most atheists will agree that, well, our actions have consequence, which is often why certain atheists are trying to talk Christians out of their Christianity, because in modernity, most atheists will say things like, well, you Christians, as long as you keep your beliefs at home and quiet, that's fine. In fact, you mentioned one of my favorite shows, which is Unbelievable with Justin Brierley. You can find a Richard Dawkins episode where Richard Dawkins came on Unbelievable, and there was a Jewish scholar and a Christian pastor. And a number of times in that episode, Richard Dawkins basically says, well, you're not the kind of Christians I'm worried about. It's the kind of Christians that are out there voting. And it's like, now, wait a minute. Do you really mean to disenfranchise anyone with religious beliefs, where in America, that's 85 to 90% of the population will say there is a God? What kind of tyranny are you presupposing with this? So I think in almost every case, Christians are better off. I think most of this apologetics actually is pointed towards Christians, because the arguments from naturalism have a great degree of public status. And so many times people are sort of embarrassed out of their faith rather than reason their way from it. And I think this is part of the reason. First of all, human beings are naturally religious. And when people deconstruct, there might be a phase at which they're really sort of watching their mouth and being cautious about agency. But before you know it, they're going to be talking to the universe and talking about karma. And you're going to very quickly re-enchant their universe, because atheists at funerals just don't have a lot to say. And try as they might.
They're speechless.
Because there he is, dead.
That's what happens.
Which does nothing for a grieving family and winds up being heartless. And so what tends to happen is people default to all sorts of folk religion and superstition to sort of make up some words to continue to add a religious patina, because they have found that nihilism will pretty much just kind of get you depressed unless you can distract yourself on a very consistent basis.
Yeah, and that's what the existentialists, they understood. Existentialists like Sartre, Camus, just different ones, that they understood that without God, life is ultimately meaningless. Dostoevsky said, if God does not exist, all is permitted.
I'm currently reading Brothers Karamazov, by the way, so that's very relevant.
Great. Very, very nice. it seems to me that not only does, belief in God or theism give an ontology of grounding of things we know in everyday life by our intuitions. We know that some things are certainly good, some things are certainly bad, but it gives a psychological and spiritual healing to man's multidimensional nature. We're not just physical beings, Paul. As a pastor, you know this. We're not just physical beings, but we have spiritual needs. We have moral needs. We seek something higher. Theism, I think, is multidimensional. Gives different layers to this question, and atheism doesn't. So it doesn't seem to me that atheism is livable, even at the level of lived life, even at the level of, giving a grieving person hope. Do you have anything else to say about that, Paul?
I agree. Every now and then the Freedom from Religions Foundation will put up a billboard in my neighborhood, and I usually take pictures of them because I find them interesting and they make good sermon illustrations. And they'll talk about, free from religion and, experiencing wonder. But if you look at C.S. Lewis's book, the book slips my mind.
Surprised by Hope?
No.
Murky, Surprised by Hope?
No. It doesn't matter. But Lewis makes the point that is this merely a feeling of wonder, or does the abolition of man, or does wonder actually see through to something more? And if you lock yourself into an epistemic system by which wonder, joy, many of the people that I've spoken with in my Jordan Peterson journey, I remember one individual very early on found me after I'd made my video and said, I was an atheist, and then I had a daughter. And suddenly I discovered that, what wouldn't I do for this daughter? Now, at one level, I could say, well, it's been coded into me to, preserve my offspring. But on another level, I said, that can't be all this is. There must be some value that my daughter has, that these feelings are actually getting in touch with, that are beyond me. And this, in fact, scales up to the rest of my life. Because if you say, well, I'm experiencing wonder, well, suppose I was able to manufacture a drug that would induce the right chemicals in your brain to feel wonder, or just put on a TV show or a Netflix program that had wonder.
Sorry.
That's okay. Meaning goes a lot further. So, I don't know, Robert. What do you think?
No, I mean, I love.
Sorry,
I love all that. No problem, Josh.
Minor emergency. Everything's fine. I just had to check on my wife.
Oh, okay. That was an incredibly quick fix for emergency.
Yeah, I just had to ask her if she was okay. Everything was fine.
Good.
Okay.
So
hey, look, he's an attentive husband, just like you're talking about with the daughter. Is that meaningless?
But Paul, I wanted to say the sense of wonder, the sense of the imagination, the sense of or the sense of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, even. I take those as signposts. One is the wonder that looks to something beyond. The Holy Spirit looks to something within. It seems to me that is the logos in action. It seems to me that the atheist, even printing or making a billboard, is trying to communicate something that shows truth in it, communicate some truth to the public. It seems to me by doing that, he's working under a set of assumption, and that the logos is at the center of his set of assumptions. So it seems to me that whenever we try to talk or communicate meaningfully, we are presupposing the logos in communication. We're given an argument for God by virtually everything we do.
One thing I wanted to add on to that is that I want to affirm everything Paul and you're saying, Josh. I think a skeptic listening to this might say, this all sounds a little too close to human psychology, everything you're saying about meaning, morality, what's the external stuff? And part of what makes it powerful, well, first of all, what we're trying to do is find which lens gives us the best understanding, the best viewpoint of reality that explains it the best. Very much in that C.S. Lewis sort of way of, I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun, not just because I see it, but by it, I see everything else. So you're trying to see which lens works best. And I think the arguments we're talking about here do stand on their own, but I think they do become much more powerful when you add in some of the other reasons to believe that feel farther away from simply human psychology. Because when you have those as well, just, Jesus's resurrection, like when you look into the historical data there, it adds this other piece that it becomes a bit of a virtuous circle.
A multifaceted explanation.
Yeah, where it's it just feels like, okay, now this explanation for morality and meaning that already felt compelling, but maybe I had a slight suspicion about it being too close to human psychology. Now I'm actually trusting it more because there's also more external reasons. So yes, it becomes this multifaceted explanation. And I think you need the more immediate reasons too, because some of the very abstract reasons we're actually less sure about because they are far away and some are scientific and science changes. But some of those more immediate ones are less likely to change, like about our sense of morality.
Absolutely. And it's not just, lived life or psychology, but it's also the beginning of the universe shows the existence of God, in my opinion, in the opinion of a number of physicists. Christopher Isham, for example, one of Britain's leading astrophysicists. I could keep going on naming lots of them, and I have tons of quotes on here, but the design, the inherent design in nature, how it points to something, that things have causes too. Causes. What is causality? Causality is the belief that for something to occur, it needs a productive cause, not just not saying that non-being can't cause being. That's an impossibility. For being to arise, for the universe to arise, it needs a cause, or it needs an explanation. Now, how do we account for logical, reasonable people like you, me, or even anybody walking down the street? Well, the cause must not be an impersonal force, because you would never get rational creatures. The cause must be have these innate dispositions of a rational nature that has given us rationality. So I think there are a number of type of arguments. You pointed to the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Craig Keener has pointed out that miracles happen all over the world.
Miracles are a big one for me, for sure.
Yeah, and me too. The naturalist that just wants to dismiss all miracles, or saying that David Hume or Immanuel Kant or Spinoza somehow gave a devastating critique, doesn't really take into account that these miracle reports all around the world. I think I may have lost you. Oh, there you are, Robert. Just making sure. But like I said, theism, I think that you were hinting at, is a multi-level explanation rather than just trying to reduce everything to natural causes. Paul, do you have anything to say about how theism seems to explain a whole host of phenomena, the beginning of the universe, the possibility of change in the universe, how that needs something that's changeless, the possibility of rationality, the possibility of that we're rational creatures, miracles. Do you see how theism, Christian theism, is a multifaceted explanation that accounts for a whole variety of phenomena?
One of my favorite books is C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, and it was, that's been a book that I've read numerous times in my life. I want to be very careful about not speaking at individuals, because if someone is watching this program and they are considering Christianity, they are probably doing so for reasons they might not fully understand. They feel themselves strangely drawn to something. And as you said earlier, Josh, I think part of the implication of Tom Holland's book is that the distance between Christians and atheists is not anywhere near as far as a lot of these conversations imagine them to be. So one of the things that as I said, I think a lot of people identify as atheists for very social reasons, because in certain times and places, it seems you lose status. You lose status by saying things like, well, I pray to Jesus when I'm scared. Oh, it's just a crutch. No, but Christians at the same time, and I just read an article recently that said churches are losing millennials and Gen Zs at a rate of 4-1 in terms of what they're gaining. Now that's a significant number, and that's something that Christians need to pay a lot of attention to. And as you said earlier, Josh,
come back though. Many of them come back, and it's a lot of the liberal churches that are losing people. The conservative churches are standing firm or growing.
Yeah, Pew has some interesting numbers on some of these things, but my point was that, even myself as a Christian pastor, I understand the tug of unbelief. We live in a society where, for a whole variety of historic reasons, especially after 9/11, and so for myself, who's in my 50s, I remember a world in which Christianity was less suspect and more assumed. Now we tend to live in a world, when I grew up, Christians were sort of super moralists, but Christian moralism was generally accepted. Now, more often, Christians are seen as immoral, and questions of moral status are very powerful in terms of how people choose to identify publicly. So Christians, there are a lot of Christians who I think are having deep questions about morality, and they are immersed in a culture that is basically suggesting to them, disaffiliate, no longer identify as a Christian, and you will have greater moral status. And so for me, part of that had been, for a number of years, reading C.S. Lewis's Miracles, 2 or 3 times a year, because what he does in that book is connect a lot of things together that you were just asking me about, connecting rationality. And for Lewis, in fact, in that book, rationality itself, this power that we have, that we find no other creatures on this world seem to possess, this power that we have to sort of self-transcend, put arguments together, think things through imaginatively, and actually proceed towards goals. C.S. Lewis, in a way, in that book, sort of finds these as little tells of God's image in us. And of course, in the classical period, human rationality was considered to be part of the Imago Dei. So there's a lot going on here, but I very much don't want to ostracize Christians that are sort of feeling a little wobbly, because in my experience, many of those people are watching this show a lot more than hard-bitten atheists. And so the arguments that we're dealing with tend to encourage Christians to say, you're not unreasonable, you're not irrational, in fact, you're not immoral. And these questions that are sort of floating around in their world, often much more by insinuation, should probably be lifted out into the light and say, well, let's take a look at these things and see whether all of the dressing up of them, the fashionable dressing up of them, is really warranted.
And that's why I think Christians should be bold, even if they have doubts from time to time. There's a difference between having doubts from time to time and trusting in something firm. Thomas had doubts, but then Jesus appeared to him, and it implies that he touched Jesus. We can trust things in the past. We can trust history, like Edmund Burke says. Before trying to rewrite history, let's look at the past, how we got here. There's probably many, many reasons, a plethora of reasons, why Christian theism is true. So be mindful of the atheist apologist trying to persuade you on these frivolous skepticism, and look at the long debate that's taken thousands of years, and why Christianity is here. Perhaps it's here because it is rational. Perhaps so many things in our life point to Christian theism being true, things that we don't even know about. Jordan Peterson has talked about this, how we act out the logos. But here's a question I have for y'all. This goes into a little different direction. What happens when we idealize certain doctrines over and above other doctrines? For example, I think a lot of the skepticism, a lot of the atheism around today is because atheists and naturalists have idealized the doctrine of freedom. Thinking that they can, or the doctrine of individuality, this radical individuality. Whatever I say is true. They try to make guides of these doctrines that they take from the Christian worldview, and they try to make them into something that controls their own life. And it almost seems that they follow these other type of gods, these smaller gods. I'm speaking a little metaphorically here. Paul, do you have anything to say about that?
I think I've talked enough. What do you think, Robert?
Robert.
Well, let me add on.
I'm sorry if I keep going to your accident.
Hey, Paul's a brilliant guy. I'm enraptured by what he's saying, so I understand. No, I wanted to add on. Paul mentioned how sometimes, or more lately today, you hear Christians being seen as the immoral ones. And sometimes I think we would all agree for valid reasons. And one of my good friends actually just started a podcast, mostly interviewing people like deconstructing. She has done her own deconstructing. I don't totally know where she stands, but definitely, outside the church. And I've listened to a couple of the episodes. She's a great host. It's a great podcast. It's called the Babel Podcast for those interested. But it was interesting listening to some of the elements of her story and other stories. And one thought came to my mind that I would want to point out to someone thinking about these things. If someone who didn't know anything about Christianity read or heard these stories and then read the Gospels, I think they would say that the people that they were reminded of by these stories, by the harm that was caused to my friends, the people they would be reminded of would be the Pharisees, not Jesus. And I think we have to be really careful that the same goes for a lot of the things that are complained about Christians today. Like I said, sometimes rightly. it's worthwhile to ask which of those things really remind you of Jesus or remind you of the Pharisees, because I'm tempted to say like 90% really would remind you of the Pharisees. And so that just means, are we really criticizing Christianity or the way Christians are handling things today? And that doesn't answer all the questions. Like, some people do have some objections about Jesus himself. And you could also ask, okay, why aren't Christians behaving more like Jesus? But it's a really helpful level set to say that, like, if you're a Christian and you're really struggling with how the church handles a lot of stuff, church abuse, all this stuff, not protecting the innocent, the victims. And it's like, who does that remind you of? If you just step back and read the Gospels, it's not going to remind you of Jesus. It's not going to remind you of the Good Samaritan. It's going to remind you of people like the Pharisees. And so I think that can be a helpful reset to know what we're actually evaluating.
Yeah, I think we have to recognize nobody is perfect, but we all have to have humility. And when we go astray, ask for forgiveness, talk to God, and then dust the dirt off your shoes and get back in the game. The most important thing, and like how I started this, the most important thing is proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what we need to do. That's what the answer is. When you don't proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, Paul, you make idols out of certain things like money or sex or power. These things, money, sex, and power. Thomas Aquinas even talks about them. I think he uses different words, but they're basically the same thing. But money, sex, and power can become God's substitutes in people's lives. The gospel of Jesus Christ is a far superior path than the false gods of money, sex, and power, when people can become consumed by them. Paul, can you speak to that? The secular gods of money, sex, or power, those false gods, and how we should have humility? Look at history, look at the long debate, and maybe there are innumerable reasons to be a Christian rather than follow those false gods of money, sex, and power.
Well, John Calvin made the comment that our hearts are idol makers, and he was following Augustine, noting that if you take a good, almost any good, and turn it into an ultimate good, you will live your life. You will live your life for that thing. Tim Keller has written some excellent books on this topic. The only safe place to place the ultimate is actually above the world that we live in. Viktor Frankl, who was a young Jewish psychologist, I believe he was recently married. He was in Nazi Germany. He, his father, his wife were all rounded up into a camp. And being a young psychologist, decided, living in the midst of a living laboratory, I should pay attention to what's going on. And what he discovered was that for everyone, so he was standing in line once with his father, and the women's camp was just over there, and they were looking over and trying to keep tabs on loved ones, of course, to the best that they could. And somebody asked his father, did you see my wife? Did you see my wife? Oh, yes, I saw your wife. Your wife is fine. And Viktor Frankl said to his father, a little later, said, why did you lie to that man? And because as long as he thinks that his wife is alive, he will live. And so Frankl saw that anything that is in this world that can be taken from you, if you make that the center of your life, you are vulnerable to what I call the age of decay. The only safe place to place your heart is on something outside of the age of decay, and is to have your highest love, of course, be the love of God. And if that is the case, then all of the other loves can find their appropriate place. And I think that is, Jesus' great command, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself.
That's well said. It points to something transcendent. All the good things that we hold firmly points to something transcendent that holds them, that agape love. It holds them together. Robert,
just to add on, to add on to what Paul said, I think what happens too is there's a lot of people who realize essentially what Paul said, but they don't know the answer, is Christianity. But they realize that sex or money or power or whatever, any of these kind of material things or immediate things are not going to be ultimately fulfilling. And so then you're forced into the world of all these other philosophies where Christianity is among them. And you kind of come full circle back to the Jordan Peterson sort of thing of like, you can either really believe something is true that you might admit you don't have a good reason to believe in, like karma or astrology or something like that. You might become this pragmatist like Jordan Peterson, where I'm going to live like it's true, even though I don't necessarily literally believe it's true. The really distasteful or unappetizing option is what I could call the hardcore atheist, the Bertrand Russell, that you just kind of you bite into the unyielding despair, as he described it, to build your foundation on, which that is a very hard pill to swallow. All right, guys, we're just going to go ahead and decide unyielding despair and then build on top of that. And there's something when you try on that Christian worldview of, I think Christianity also gives something that's somewhat unique, which is, or maybe totally unique, and I think ultimately it is this unconditional love combined with an urgency. Because I think there is a lot of philosophies where, the universe loves you, we all return to the universe, but there's no teeth to it. It doesn't explain suffering. It doesn't give us a way forward, not necessarily anything to look forward to. And I think Christianity is a more realistic faith about how much suffering there is and the reality of sin. But then you have that fountain of unconditional love and a perfect being watching out for you too. And something fits there, I think.
This is going to be my last question, and we're going to sum up. But something you said, Robert, I believe, and Paul, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. N.T. Wright has talked about this. I believe it's in 1 Corinthians 15. After Paul gives a detailed, an account of the witnesses that saw the risen Jesus, that were witnesses, Peter and the group of 500 and many different individuals and groups. He says, now that Christ has risen, let's get on with it. Let's do this, get on with it. Because Christ is risen, because Christianity is true, or because the vast majority lives as though Christianity is true by being living embodiments of the Logos. Paul, how do you think in the future, or maybe in the past, all the way it is today, how do you think Christianity gives a person a will, a foundation, a will to live and to build orphanages, to build hospitals, to treat thy neighbor as thyself, to love unconditionally, even though the atheist may give these spurious arguments, may even call you names? Still pray for them. What does that mean? What does that mean to you? How does Christianity answer those questions?
Well, almost all of my sermons, I usually do a rough draft on my personal channel, and then of course the sermons are found on my church channel. I structure almost all of my sermons with the structure of the Heidelberg Catechism, and I prefer the older words, which are misery, deliverance, gratitude. I think what Christianity affords us is a freedom. While we all have a natural tendency to be selfish and self-serving, if that is played out in our lives, we don't become the best neighbors. We might try to be good neighbors because we want to uphold our reputation, but essentially we live for ourselves. If, in fact, the gospel is true, and so I get in touch with my misery that I can't save myself, and then gratitude. Well, Christ has reached down to rescue me, not only from myself, but from this present sinful age. Now suddenly I have a radical freedom, whereas unlike if you're a materialist atheist that you say you only live once, then suddenly I am under a tremendous burden to achieve all my goals, experience as much of life as possible. I'm going to wear myself out, usually seeking adventures or pleasures or satisfaction in this world. As a Christian, what I can actually do is live out of gratitude for what Christ has done for me, which makes me now want to actually love my neighbor and work for the world's work for what's best for the world, work for the common good. Now, and I think if you actually we want to live in a society where our neighbors have this motivation. Well, if that is true, then maybe we should live it ourselves. And I think the only way you can actually do that is if you have a vivid realization of the reality of the resurrection, which affords a radical freedom to say, I can spend this very short life within the age of decay, loving and serving my neighbor, because I am freed from the anxiety of not getting everything in. And I think that's simply a better way to live, not only personally, but also for the rest of the world.
Yeah. You talk about anxiety. Yeah, there is absolutely nothing to worry about anymore. If we have Christ within us, all is rock and roll at the end. I think N.T. Wright mentioned that in a podcast.
Did he say rock and roll?
He was in a cab and he mentions the cab driver talked to him like that.
He might have referenced Bob Dylan instead, because that would be more like N.T. Wright.
Wright plays the guitar. You can find him on YouTube playing the guitar.
I've heard him playing some Bob Dylan before.
Could have been Bob Dylan or Wham. I'm not sure. No, it probably wasn't Wham. Let's be honest. Also, I think Christianity also provides for a basis for our bodies, the goodness of creation, our physical bodies, how what we do in our body has eternal implications. And we shouldn't just be doing drugs or having sex with countless people. There's a way to act. We should be in a relationship, a marriage, and the body is important. It has intrinsic importance. But Robert, the same question that I asked Paul a minute ago, and I'm sorry for my long-winded questions, but how would you answer that? And feel free to pick up where Paul left off or go in your own direction.
Yeah. First of all, I'm not a pastor, so I'm not used to, writing up my sermon notes and inspiring people. I end up being perhaps too cognitive on my own podcast. But ultimately, who cares about the cognitive when that's not why we live life, So I think what came to mind when listening to Paul and just thinking about the question is a few different things. But one is you can't underestimate what happens when you make the idea of self-sacrificial love the center of gravity of the universe. That when that becomes the center of the universe and this pointer, like even the secular world is enchanted by it, then secular world is enchanted. I mean, just watch any of our movies. The great climactic scene is the curmudgeon old guy, giving up his life in the end and having that turn, that's repentance right there as such a core feature of our stories and what we care about, and self-sacrificial love. So I think it is transformative in this way that shouldn't be underestimated. When you see people who really have made that the center of their world, I think they become pretty remarkable people. Like we remember the bad instances of Christians and we remember a lot of the bad people in our lives. But when we think of the people who truly surprise us with their grace and love, I think a lot of that is being transformed around that idea of self-sacrificial love. And it gives us the theology behind it, the philosophy behind us. Yeah, it gives us the ability to let go of ourselves, because otherwise we wouldn't almost be able to, because we would only have this world and it would be hard to let go of that. But we have that grace, and within that grace and gratitude, it enables us to live out that self-sacrificial life, even if we, of course, screw up, because we still have that sinful nature.
Yeah, Christianity, Christian theism, has a philosophical grounding to it, shaped by Augustine, Aquinas, so many Christian thinkers that gave these sophisticated philosophical arguments for grounding the world of being and the world of becoming, those things we take for granted in common sense, change and so forth. But it also speaks to the personal nature of who we are, of what it means to be a person, that self-sacrificing love, that the logos, that indwelling of the logos. Anyway, guys, I want to thank you so much for coming on, both of you. Paul Vander Klay, thank you so much. I don't think you know this. Well, I know you don't know it. I haven't told you. I've preached a few times, and you just get, you make me want to start again. But maybe fill in once or twice. I'm just so excited. I'm excited about proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what this podcast is for. And Robert, thank you so much for coming on. You're a great intellectual. You've given great answers. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I guess that's it. So,
Josh, thanks for having us on. It's a great discussion. It's clear you have a heart for Jesus and for getting this out there, and wanting to ground it in reason and truth. And I think that's very valuable.
Absolutely. Well, guys,
and Paul, it was great talking to you too.
It's great meeting you, Robert.
Have a great night, guys. God bless. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Bye-bye.